Today I will tell you the story of the Christmas when my own family told me I was not welcome, and how in less than a day the truth they had buried for years finally came to light. She stood in the warm glow of Christmas lights, her silhouette framed by the golden shimmer against the night. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, held a half-full glass of red wine in her manicured hand. Her smile was thin-sharp at the edges. "Barbara? This year there's no place for you at the table." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut cleaner than ice. Behind her I could see my son Nathan adjusting the lights on the tree, pretending he hadn't heard. The cold that gripped me did not come from the snow swirling at my boots. It came from that voice, from the hollow look in my own son's eyes. I pulled my cardigan tighter, forcing my lips into a smile. "I understand," I said softly, and then I turned, stepping away from the warmth, letting the snow swallow my figure. The sound of the door closing behind me was sharper than the winter wind. 6 hours later, my phone would not stop buzzing. Calls, messages, notifications piling up like snowdrifts. They had finally understood, but I did not answer. Not yet. I am Barbara, 71 years old, and what happened that night was not just about Christmas. It was about years of choices, loyalties, and debts, emotional and otherwise, that no one in that house had dared to acknowledge. Until now. That night, as I walked down South Hill, the quiet streets of Spokane dressed in garlands and wreaths, I thought of all the Decembers I had spent making sure my son and his family had everything they needed. Mortgage payments when Nathan was between jobs, grocery bills when Melissa's boutique wasn't turning a profit. I had told myself it was what mothers did, but somewhere between the checks I wrote and the invitations I waited for, something shifted. My generosity became their expectation, and this year it seemed my presence had become their inconvenience. I did not go home that night. Instead, I turned toward the soft glow coming from the corner window of Evelyn's kitchen. Evelyn, my oldest friend, a retired lawyer with a spine of steel and a heart that understood mine without me needing to explain. She opened her door before I could knock, twice her eyebrows lifting at the sight of me dusted in snow. They said no, I told her simply. She handed me a mug of cinnamon tea, her eyes narrowing as she placed a blanket over my shoulders. "Then they've forgotten who you are, Barbara, and sometimes people need to be reminded." She didn't mean with raised voices or slammed doors. Evelyn had never believed in shouting wars. She believed in light bright enough to make shadows impossible to ignore, and I had learned long ago she was always right. Before I go on, if you believe stories like this matter, stories about family truth, and the strength it takes to stand your ground, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share your own thoughts in the comments. This is one of many grandma life stories where dignity, wisdom, and a little courage change everything. Because what happened after I walked away from that door would change more than just my Christmas. It would change my family's story forever. I drove slowly, letting the tires crunch over fresh snow, the glow of Christmas lights blurring past my window. The streets of South Hill were quiet, except for the occasional shadow of a neighbor carrying wrapped gifts. My hands gripped the wheel, not from the cold, but from the weight of memories pressing in. 5 years. That was how long I had been covering the shortfalls for Nathan and Melissa. At first it had felt like love in action, a mother's hand steadying her son during a rough patch. I remember the first time Melissa asked for help. Nathan had just lost his job at the lumber company. It was early January, the wind sharp against the eaves of their porch. Melissa had called me to talk over tea, but I'd barely set my cup down before she began. "You know, just until Nathan gets back on his feet," she said, stirring her tea as if the sugar was more interesting than my face. "It's only a few months of mortgage payments. We'll pay you back, of course." I agreed before she even finished the sentence. It was my son's home, my grandchildren's shelter. What kind of mother would I be if I let them struggle? But months turned into a year, and the promise of repayment quietly dissolved. Each time I thought about asking, there was another unexpected expense. a leak in the roof, a car that needed new tires, Melissa's boutique needing inventory before the spring season, and I paid, every time. The truth was, I didn't just give them money, I gave them permission. Somewhere in that 5-year stretch, the line between emergency help and a standing obligation blurred. I'd been so focused on protecting them from hardship that I never considered what I might be teaching them about responsibility or the lack of it. As I turned onto Jefferson Street, the lights from the big Victorian houses shimmered across the snow, each one looking like a postcard from a life I thought we'd built together. Nathan had grown up in a modest home, watching me stretch every dollar. I had believed that would make him careful, appreciative. But maybe I had mistaken comfort for character. The thought stung. Was this my fault? Had I, in my desperate need to keep the family safe, removed every bump in the road so they never learned to steer for themselves? The question sat heavy in my chest. It was easier to blame Melissa, her cool politeness, the way she always seemed to calculate what she could get from a situation. But Nathan had my eyes. He knew better. And yet tonight, he hadn't even looked at me when his wife told me there was no place for me. The heater hummed in the car warm air, fogging the edges of the windshield. I could have driven straight home, shut the curtains, and spent Christmas Eve in silence. That would have been easier, less complicated, but I didn't turn toward my neighborhood. Instead, I steered toward Cedar Avenue, toward the 4th-floor apartment with the wide bay window where Evelyn Clark lived. Evelyn and I had met decades ago when she was a junior associate at a downtown law firm, and I was working in the city clerk's office. Even then, she had the kind of sharp, deliberate mind that could cut through excuses like a knife through ribbon. She'd retired 3 years ago, but her instincts hadn't dulled. If anything, they'd sharpened. She was the one person I knew who would hear this story and not just pat my hand in pity. She would ask the hard questions, the same ones I was already asking myself. The drive to her building took only 10 minutes, but it felt longer. With each red light, I replayed moments I had tried to forget. Melissa at my kitchen table casually mentioning the down payment I could contribute to her new boutique. Nathan calling at midnight to say they were a little short on the mortgage, his voice sheepish, but not exactly apologetic, and always me agreeing before the second sentence was out. I had thought I was holding my family together, but maybe I was just holding them back. As I pulled into the parking lot beneath Evelyn's building, the snow was falling heavier now, the flakes catching in the glow of the street lamps. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, watching the light swirl in the dark. If Melissa thought there was no place for me at her table, perhaps she was right. Maybe my place wasn't there anymore. But that didn't mean I had no place at all. I turned off the ignition and stepped into the cold, the sharp air clearing the fog in my mind. Evelyn's window was lit just as I knew it would be, and with each step toward her door, the certainty grew tonight was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Evelyn's apartment was already warm before I stepped inside, but the heat that greeted me was different, comforting in a way that thawed more than my fingers. Her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and slow-burning oak logs, the kind of scent that makes you want to sit down and talk about things you've been holding in for too long. She took my coat without asking, draping it over the chair, and slid a steaming mug toward me. "Sit," she said. I sat. For a while, I just listened to the faint crackle from the fireplace in the adjoining room, watching the steam curl from my tea. Evelyn didn't rush me. She never did. She knew that some words have to be coaxed out like knots in a rope. When I finally told her what had happened, Melissa at the door, the words, "No place like a shard of ice." Nathan's eyes turned away. Evelyn's expression shifted. At first, there was the faintest flicker of sympathy, the kind she reserved for life's small cruelties. But as I went on about the years of mortgage payments, the boutique expenses, the endless emergencies, her face hardened. By the time I reached the end, she was leaning back in her chair, arms crossed the lawyer in her fully awake. "Barbara," she said slowly, "do you know why Melissa never worries about you saying no?" The question caught me off guard, because she knows I won't. Evelyn shook her head. because she's been playing this game for longer than you realize." She stood, walked over to the counter, and picked up a folder from the corner. I recognized the tidy columns of financial records even before she slid the pages toward me. Evelyn had always had a way of finding things out. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Melissa's name was there in court filings, creditor notices, even a bankruptcy declaration from 2 years ago. Yet she'd never mentioned it. I thought of her designer coats, the catered birthday parties for the kids, the leased SUV with leather seats. She's bankrupt. My voice was a whisper. Evelyn nodded, completely. But here's the thing her social circle doesn't know. As far as they're concerned, she's still one of them. The trips, the clothes, the events, all of it paid for with your help. She's been using your money to keep up the performance. I sat back, the weight of it pressing against my chest. All these years I thought I'd been protecting my son's family from hardship. Instead, I'd been financing a lie. Evelyn's eyes were steady on mine. "You said she told you there's no place for you this year. That's not just cruelty, Barbara, it's arrogance. She believes you'll always be there whether you're invited or not. Because in her mind, you're not a person, you're a resource." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I took a sip of tea, the cinnamon biting my tongue. "So, what do I do? Just cut them off?" Evelyn shook her head again, this time with a faint smile. "Cutting them off is messy. It makes you the villain in their story. If you want this to end, you have to hit them where it actually hurts." I frowned. "Their bank account." Her smile widened. "Their reputation." I thought of Melissa's friends, the other boutique owners, the neighborhood committee, the parents from the private school the kids attended. People who prided themselves on success, on appearances. The image Melissa had been curating for years wasn't just important to her, it was her currency. If you pull the right thread, Evelyn said, the whole fabric unravels. And you won't have to raise your voice once. The fire popped in the other room, sending a faint ember glow into the kitchen. I stared into my mug, watching the ripples fade. I had never been the kind of person to humiliate someone, especially not family. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about stopping a cycle that had turned me into an accessory to someone else's false life. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low. "Think about it. What do they need from you right now? Not money, something else. Something they're counting on you to provide without question. That's your leverage." The image began to form in my mind. The upcoming charity gala Melissa was chairing, the guest list packed with the city's most influential names, and the fact that the sponsorship she'd been bragging about, it came from me. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Evelyn was right. This wasn't the end of my place in the family. It was the start of reclaiming it. On my terms. When I finally looked up, Evelyn was watching me with that same knowing look she'd had since we were 25 and plotting our first City Hall win. "I can see the wheels turning," she said. "They are," I admitted. "And this time, I'm not going to give them the ending they expect." I left Evelyn's kitchen with cinnamon on my tongue, and her counsel settled like a compass. If this was going to end, it would end in daylight. Reputation was Melissa's currency, and truth would be mine. Snow thickened as I crossed the hall of my building and knocked on the door opposite mine. Howard Price answered on the second knock. The apartment smelled of coffee and printer ink. His eyes focused the way a lens tightens. "Come in," he said. "You look like you need heat and a chair." "I need order," I said. "And someone who keeps his word." Before I began, a memory cued itself. Weeks earlier on the stairs, he had asked whether I had seen how high South Hill appraisals had climbed. He named my son's address on Grand Boulevard, called it beautiful, said numbers rarely tell the full weight families carry. I deflected. He let it go. The line stayed with me. I placed my canvas tote at my feet. Before anything I said, there are boundaries. I will not harm my grandchildren. No photos, no school names, no details that invite strangers. He clicked his pen. Consent and clarity. You set the lines. I stay inside them. Nothing goes out without your approval. And accuracy, I said. No heat that is not also light. Deal, he said. Start where it started. I set a manila folder on the table. Bank statements lay inside, the 15th circled in yellow where the same transfer drained my account each month, copies of checks, a spreadsheet I typed at my kitchen table, receipts for utilities, tires, a water heater, a contractor who fixed a roof I never sat under. He penciled dates on page corners and placed slim flags where he would verify. How did the first ask happen, he said. Tea at Melissa's table, I answered. Nathan had lost a job, a few months to bridge the gap. We would revisit later. Later never came. He asked how the tone shifted from emergency to routine, whether repayment was ever written down, what words were used when I hesitated. I told him about midnight calls that sounded sheepish rather than ashamed, about my fear that saying no would crack the peace my grandkids needed. I told him I had spent 3 decades teaching second graders that promises matter. Somewhere along the way, I stopped requiring the same from adults. He tapped the next folder. Inside sat a sponsorship form for a winter gala Melissa had been boasting about my name printed on the pledge line. This is how the image holds, he said. Shine outside. Debt inside. Evelyn says image is their shelter. She says daylight is the only tool that works. Your story is not about crime, he said. It is about boundaries worn down that truly need repair. People recognize themselves in that. Here's my plan. We build a clean timeline, corroborate with public records. I request property documents for the South Hill address and check the bankruptcy docket under Melissa's name. I confirm with a courthouse clerk. We keep adjectives on a leash and let documents speak. I slid over a thinner envelope. Screenshots of messages began polite and ended urgent. Could you help with the insurance? The power bill is due. The boutique spring line needs inventory. Thank you, you are saving us. Lined up the pattern looked like rails running through my pension. Howard studied them without heroics. You were underwriting a narrative, he said. That is why it consumed so much of you. If this moves forward, I said, we do not make a spectacle of Christmas. The lesson is not a holiday. It is how you treat the person who kept the lights on. Understood, he said. One condition. If anything risks your legal safety, I tell you first. We proceed only with what we can prove. Prove it is, I said. We set next steps. He would scan and catalog the documents tonight and draft a verification list. Tomorrow, only if I agreed, he would contact an editor who values restraint. We would move at my pace. We would protect the children. Facts would carry the weight. When I rose to leave, the snow had thickened enough to crown the streetlights. He walked me to the door and offered his hand. Thank you for trusting me, he said. I am not outsourcing courage, I replied. Only structure. Back in the corridor, the sconces hummed. The building settled, and something in me settled with it like a picture finally straight on the wall. I had spent years paying for a house that never felt like home. Tonight I gave the truth a different address, and for the first time in a long while, I knew where I was going next. I came home, cleared the kitchen table, and spread manila folders until the wood disappeared. The lamp washed everything in amber, paper first, pixels later. I wanted the truth to sit where a plate should have been on Christmas Day. The bank statements lived at the back of a bottom drawer. I arranged them by month, 15th after 15th, a corridor of numbers. Each transfer marched to the same destination and amount. It felt like listening to one unchanging note. I circled the lines in yellow. I flipped open the small ledger I kept in pencil. Numbers alone never say enough. The margins carried the rest. February, their roof took water. May, camp deposit for the kids. August, tires for Nathan's car. December, the mortgage draft needed help again. Then came the check images printed when a suspicion began to nag. Payees repeated like neighbors you nod to every morning. A vista for power. City utilities. A contractor who patched a driveway I seldom used. County property taxes. I slid each set into clear sleeves and aligned the dates. My phone held the folder called Winter List. Screenshot by screenshot, the tone of 5 years scrolled by. At first, the messages asked with courtesy, "Could you help this week? When it eases, we will repay." Eventually, the verbs changed. Need today, sending the account details, thank you in advance. I printed the thread and wrote the date range on a bright sticker. Photographs followed. Nothing private, only what Melissa chose to share. River Park Square, bags held like trophies, a candlelit tasting downtown, a new coat the color of winter cherries. I paired each post with a receipt. A single line item meant little by itself. A series showed what I had been underwriting. I reached for my own house folder, thin as a breath. The roof estimate from last spring was still paper clipped to a note that read, "Not yet." I heard the drip I had learned to catch with a mixing bowl. I delayed the repair because Nathan said his draft would bounce. I believed the word temporary. Another memory surfaced while I sorted. The winter, I kept my worn tires. The clerk on Monroe Street pressing his lips together before suggesting I return when ready. I drove home slowly that month with both hands on the wheel. In my ledger the same day carried a different entry in small, stubborn letters. Insurance premium due today. I paid theirs. I risked mine. I taped cardstock down the center of the table and drew a timeline. Left column, years, right column, verification. I wrote a rule to keep me honest. Every memory needs a partner. A statement must pair with a receipt. A message must pair with a date stamp. The work calmed me. I was not shaping a spectacle. I was assembling clarity. The last folder held emails from charity events where my name appeared on sponsorship lines. I highlighted the entries not for pride, but because public image would need to match public record. I added a note for Howard to confirm invoices and posting dates. When the table was full, I stood and let the room breathe. The evidence did not shout. It exhaled. I heard a postponed repair in the rustle of paper, the click of a midnight transfer in the binding rings, the whisper of envelopes sliding into mail slots. Pain lived here, but so did relief. What I had done in private finally had a shape other people could see. I paged through the binder, added sticky notes where questions might come and squared the edges with the side of my hand. Dates aligned, totals reconciled. I placed the roof estimate at the front so I would remember what my yes had cost inside my own walls. Outside, snow gathered under the street lamps on Jefferson. I fed the first page into the small scanner and waited for its steady hum. I labeled the spine in red to make the purpose unmistakably clear to everyone. When the light on the panel leveled, I slipped the drive into an envelope labeled, "For Howard," verification copy. My name went on a second binder that stayed in my cabinet. One set would leave, one set would remain. I washed my mug, dried it with the good towel reserved for guests, and hung it back on its hook. The pile on the table was not revenge. It was a map, and I was ready to follow it. Morning came thin and quiet. I carried the binder labeled, "For Howard," verification copy across the hall and knocked. He opened with a nod and cleared space on his dining table. "We build it together," he said. Plain language, strong spine. I slid the binder toward him and placed a legal pad next to his trackpad. No adjectives that accuse I said, no heat that is not earned. We started with a headline, words heavy enough to hold light enough to travel. He typed as I read from my notes. A widow in Spokane uses her pension to pay her son's mortgage. Then she is told there is no place for her at Christmas dinner. He kept the structure and set the final title in bold. Ba goa o Spokane dung, tien hu, trahoan vain ha cho kontrai, cho jen kibiloai koiban tiek giangsin. The lead followed. 4 sentences. No flourishes. He wrote that I was 71. That transfers left my account on the 15th for 5 years, that documentation existed and would be described, that names of minors and school details would be withheld. I asked for one more line, that the goal was clarity, not punishment. He built it into second paragraph. We outlined the body like a timeline you could read. Section 1, the first request, winter tea, a few months of help. Section 2, the slow shift from emergency to expectation, the way language moved from could you to need today. Section 3, public image versus private debt, sponsorships, and photographs beside receipts. Each section ended with a verification note, bank statement, page number, copy of check, date stamp on a message thread. At 10:05, we paused for coffee. He kept his questions narrow and repeatable. What was said, when, who was present, where the receipt lived. When I drifted toward how it felt, he let me finish and then circled back to what could be shown. The article would be scaffolding the public could climb without slipping. We drafted a line offering right of reply. He would email Nathan and Melissa with direct questions about the transfers and the sponsorships. He would include a deadline at 6 in the evening. If they answered, we would include their statements in full. If they declined, we would note that outreach had been made. I did not expect a response. I approved the attempt anyway. By 11:30, the draft sat in neat blocks. He read aloud to test rhythm. I corrected a date. We simplified a clause. Then we collected the exhibits. He scanned the ledger page that summarized 5 years, then the roof estimate, then the sponsorship form with my printed name. He did not photograph my grandchildren. He did not suggest their names. We wrote a caption policy and taped it to the table where we could see it: no images of children, no exterior shots that disclose addresses, no identifying details. At noon, he emailed his editor, Ruth Delgado, at the Spokane Ledger. Subject line: proposed feature for tonight. In the body, he summarized the piece, stated that sources were a first-person narrator and primary documents, attached a folder of redacted exhibits, included the right of reply plan. We waited. Ruth answered with 3 sentences and a time run it at 10 p.m. Front page digital. Comments open with moderation. Keep it sober. Her brevity steadied me more than a paragraph would have. Clockwork clicked into place. 10 p.m. was 600 minutes away. Enough time to breathe, enough to wonder whether I had waited too long to draw a boundary. Howard printed a clean copy for markup. I crossed out a phrase that leaned toward judgment. He replaced it with a number and a citation. The page read cooler. It also read stronger. At 2, he sent the right of reply emails with delivery receipts requested. At 3, we added a small sidebar that offered resources for elder financial abuse, hotline numbers, links to a state guide that explained powers of attorney and undue influence. If we were going to ask the town to look, we would hand them a light of their own. By 4, he drafted the social post that would accompany publication. No hashtags, 1 sentence, the title, and a link. We agreed he would schedule it for 10:01 so the article could land first. At 5, I walked home with the certainty of a clock set correctly. Snow squeaked under my boots, porch lights blinked on along Jefferson. I heated soup and sat by the window with my binder open and a steady courage in my chest. The plan was moving, quietly, fully documented, set to ring like a bell at the top of the hour. At exactly 10 o'clock, the clock on my mantel chimed each note clear in the quiet of my living room. I sat by the wide window, hands wrapped around a mug of peppermint tea, and watched snow sift down through the cone of light cast by the street lamp. Across the road, a neighbor's porch glowed faintly, but inside my house, the only illumination came from the soft lamp at my elbow and the blue flicker of my laptop screen. Howard had messaged me 5 minutes earlier. It's up. I refreshed the page once, then again, until the headline appeared crisp and unadorned. My breath caught. There it was, the truth arranged without venom, anchored by facts I had carried for years in manila envelopes and half-forgotten folders. My name was in the byline, not hidden behind sources close to the matter, but standing there unshielded. The first few minutes were eerily still. Then a counter ticked upward in the corner of the page, 36 views, 48:61. Comments began to thread beneath the text, each a black ribbon of opinion. She's a saint. I hope her kids are ashamed. I can't believe any child would treat their mother this way. Wait until you hear their side. Stories like this are always two-sided. The warmth from my mug seemed to reach deeper into my chest. I leaned back, letting the words wash over me, not all of them kind, but all of them proof that people were looking, thinking, debating. For so long, my sacrifices had been invisible, absorbed quietly into mortgage payments and utility bills that were not mine. Now, strangers in my own town were weighing the balance sheet of my life. Within 20 minutes, the story was shared into a neighborhood Facebook group I had been part of years ago. Then a local radio host posted the link with the caption, "Worth your time and maybe your outrage." My phone buzzed with each new tag until I set it face down on the table. Some comments defended Melissa as Evelyn had predicted. "You don't know what that family's going through financially. Why would a mother air this publicly? Handle it privately. That son has kids. Imagine what this is doing to them." They stung, but they were distant stings like cold wind on a cheek you've already numbed. For every defense of Melissa, there were 5 voices calling the situation what it was: exploitation, entitlement, cruelty, hidden under the guise of family loyalty. Howard texted again at 10:30. Trending number 4 on the Ledger site. Might break top 3. I didn't answer. I didn't want to chase the numbers. Instead, I looked past my reflection in the glass to the quiet street. Snowflakes whirled lazily toward the ground, layering the driveways and rooftops in clean white. It struck me how for years I had approached every holiday like a servant, eager to prove her worth. Cooking dishes to Melissa's taste-buying gifts that stretched my budget, showing up early to help set the table. Now I was sitting alone, my hands steady, my back straight, not scrambling to justify my place at someone else's feast. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like the one who owed the family something. The ledger was no longer balanced against me. My contribution had been weighed and recorded not in Melissa's kitchen, but in the public square. Around 11, the phone began to buzz again. Harder, this time. Calls from numbers I knew by heart. I let them roll to voicemail. There would be time for those conversations later, or perhaps not at all. The house was utterly still except for the slow tick of the clock and the occasional soft ping of another share. My tea had gone lukewarm, but I held the mug anyway, savoring its faint, sweet scent. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the story had taken its first steps into the world, and I let it go without clutching at its hem. Tonight, I owed no explanations, offered no apologies. The truth was out there, and it no longer needed me to prop it up. I sat a little straighter, the weight in my chest not gone, but shifted as if the burden had moved from my shoulders to the page where anyone could see it. The world could argue about who was right and who was wrong. I had already lived it. I didn't need to win the argument. I only needed to stop living as if I were the one in debt. That night, under the steady whisper of snow, I finally felt what I hadn't in years free. The first call came less than 15 minutes after the article went live. Nathan's name flashed across the screen, bold white letters against the black glass. I didn't move. The phone buzzed once, twice, then fell silent. It started again almost immediately. This time, it was Melissa. The contact photo I had taken years ago, her smiling at some charity gala, champagne flute in hand, seemed grotesque now. I let it ring. My tea was still in my hands, lukewarm, the steam long gone. Then a number I didn't recognize lit up. Spokane area code. I let that one die too. And another. And another. The pattern kept up: Nathan, then Melissa, then an unknown number, like they had organized shifts. I didn't need to hear their voices to know the tone, righteous, offended, maybe even tearful, all wrapped in that brittle layer of superiority they'd perfected. Somewhere between the 5th and 6th missed call, my mind drifted back to a winter, 3 years ago. Nathan had called then too, his voice casual. "Hey Mom, I hate to bother you, but my auto insurance is due today. And Melissa's tied up. She's working on something for that charity auction next weekend. Could you spot me?" Just for this month, I'd asked what she was putting together. He'd mumbled something about decorations and guest gifts. Later, scrolling through her social media, I saw her posing in front of a gilded mirror, one arm draped with a brand new handbag, the caption reading, "Prepping in style for the big night." That bag's logo gleamed in the light, a price tag. I didn't dare say out loud, lodged in my throat. I told myself then it wasn't worth the fight, that if keeping them afloat, or at least looking afloat, meant paying an insurance bill now and then, I could manage. After all, family is supposed to help. I didn't know yet how easily that help would become an expectation. The phone buzzed again, snapping me back. My eyes flicked to the clock. Nearly midnight. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing the street in unbroken white. The buzzing stopped. The house went quiet again. But not for long. At 12:30, it started all over. The sound was almost comical now, as if they believed sheer persistence could drag me into a conversation I hadn't agreed to. I turned the phone face down on the armrest and listened to it vibrate against the fabric. Around 2 a.m, the rhythm slowed. I imagined the two of them in their kitchen. Maybe Melissa pacing Nathan, scrolling on his phone, both wondering how much worse it could get if they didn't get to me first. I pictured their hands on their own devices, seeing the comments multiply, the shares spreading, the neighbors they liked to impress, reading every word. By the time dawn began to soften the edges of the snowbanks outside, the screen lit up one more time with Melissa's name. I let it buzz until the last chime faded, and then I picked up. Her voice came in tight, high-pitched, stripped of the syrupy tone she used for public events. Who did this? Who gave them this story? I didn't hurry my reply. They only wrote the truth. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a pause heavy enough to feel. Then she exhaled a sound halfway between disbelief and anger before hanging up without another word. I set the phone down gently like it was a fragile thing and reached for the kettle. The day ahead would be long, maybe even ugly, but for the first time in years, I wasn't the one scrambling to explain myself. They were. By mid-afternoon on Christmas Eve, the snow outside my porch had been churned into slush by the tires of an unfamiliar SUV. The knock on my door was sharp, urgent, the kind that demands to be answered. When I opened it, Nathan stood there, jaw tight, his wool coat dusted with snowflakes that were already melting into dark patches. Melissa trailed just behind him. Her face, usually lacquered in confidence, an expensive foundation, was pale. Her lips pressed into a colorless line. "We need to talk," Nathan said, brushing past me before I'd even stepped aside. Melissa followed, not making eye contact. I closed the door gently. "All right, talk." Nathan didn't waste time. "That article. You have to make them take it down. It's destroying us. People are calling, asking questions. The board at Melissa's charity has already scheduled a meeting. You don't understand how much damage this could do." I stood near the kitchen table, my hands resting on the back of a chair. "I understand perfectly." Melissa's voice cut in, brittle and thin. "Barbara, please. This isn't just about us. It's about our family's reputation, about appearances. You've made it seem like we've—" I interrupted, my tone calm but unyielding. "Taken advantage of me, because that's exactly what happened." Nathan's eyes flashed. "And we're still family. You can't just hang us out to dry like this. It's Christmas." I held his gaze. "You already decided which family you wanted to sit with this Christmas, and it wasn't me. So stay with them." The silence that followed was sharp enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Nathan's fists flexed at his sides, the tendons standing out against his skin. Melissa stepped forward, her composure cracking. "You don't get it," she said, her voice trembling now. "We're about to lose the house." I blinked. "Excuse me." She looked down, twisting the strap of her purse. "We've missed 3 mortgage payments, the bank's moving forward. If this story keeps spreading, no one's going to help us refinance. We'll be ruined." I felt a coldness settle in my chest, not from the winter air seeping under the door, but from the realization of how deep their mess went. "So you wanted me to keep paying for your lifestyle to keep quiet so you could keep the house you couldn't afford?" Melissa didn't answer. Nathan's jaw worked as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. I thought about the years I'd quietly diverted my own needs for theirs, the roof I'd left leaking for 2 winters, the vacations I'd never taken, the savings account that had shrunk each month. And now, faced with the fallout of their own choices, they still came to me expecting rescue. "No, I said finally. "This is yours to face, not mine." Nathan's voice rose raw and almost pleading now. "You're our mother. You're supposed to be on our side." "I am on the side of truth," I said. "And the truth is you've been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. My money. That ends now." Melissa's eyes glistened, whether from anger, humiliation, or fear I couldn't tell. She turned toward the door. "We shouldn't have come," she muttered. Nathan hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, as if waiting for me to soften to offer the lifeline I always had before. But I didn't move. I simply stood there, steady and silent, until the door opened and closed behind them. Through the front window, I watched their SUV back out of the driveway, its tires slipping slightly on the icy street, before it disappeared around the bend. I stayed there for a moment longer, my reflection faint in the glass. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just certain. This was the first Christmas in years I wouldn't be the one carrying their burdens, and it felt quietly like freedom. I sat in my armchair long after Nathan and Melissa's SUV disappeared the Christmas lights outside, casting shifting colors across the living room walls. My tea had gone cold, but my mind was burning with memories I'd long since tucked away. Nathan hadn't always been like this. I could still see him as a boy, maybe 8 years old, trudging home from school with his backpack hanging off one shoulder. That was the year the kids in his class started talking about their real houses, the kind with 2 stories, manicured lawns and driveways, wide enough for 3 cars. We lived in a modest 1-story on the edge of town, paint a little chipped grass, never quite lush. One afternoon, I'd overheard a group of boys on the sidewalk outside, their voices loud enough to cut through the kitchen window where I was washing dishes. "His house is so small, it's like a dollhouse," one of them snickered. Nathan had walked past them with his chin down his steps, quick and tight. That evening over dinner, he'd asked me almost casually, "Do you think we'll ever move to a bigger place?" I'd told him the truth, that our home was paid off, that it was ours, and that size didn't make a family happy. He'd nodded, but I saw the way his fork slowed on his plate, the way his eyes darted away from mine. Over the years, that question of bigger turned into something else. In high school, he'd gravitated toward friends whose parents drove new cars and lived in gated neighborhoods. He was polite about it, but I could sense the quiet envy. It wasn't greed, then it was the hunger to fit in, to be enough. When he met Melissa in college, I thought maybe that hunger would settle. She came from money, or at least carried herself like she did. But in truth, her family's wealth had always been more image than substance. Still, she knew how to navigate the world Nathan admired: charity galas, country club, dinners, the unspoken rules of polished social climbing. Melissa didn't just understand Nathan's longing for status, she amplified it. She dressed it up in the language of providing for the family and making a good impression. She made him believe that a big house in South Hill wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity, a shield against the shame he'd felt as a boy with a too small house and the wrong address. I remembered one evening, maybe 5 years ago, when Nathan called me out of the blue. Mom, the bank approved us for the house. He said, his voice almost trembling with excitement. "It's everything we dreamed of. But the down payment is a stretch. Melissa says it would mean the world if you could help, just this once." I'd hesitated, not because I didn't want to help, but because I saw the pattern forming. Still, I agreed. I told myself it was what any mother would do: help her child feel secure, give him what I couldn't when he was younger. But just this once became a habit. Each time there was a reason that sounded urgent, even noble. Melissa needed to host a charity event to keep her board position. They needed to upgrade the kitchen before selling, even though they never planned to sell. There was always some looming threat to their image, and Nathan couldn't bear to let it crack. Sitting there now, I realized the tragedy wasn't only in how they had taken from me. It was in how Nathan had let his worth be measured by square footage and brand labels. He wasn't simply a man who had used his mother's money. He was a man trapped in a story he'd been telling himself since childhood, that he was only as good as the house he lived in. Melissa had learned to play that story like a piano, each note striking a chord in his pride. And in the process, she had kept him from ever questioning whether the music was worth the cost. I sighed and set my cold tea aside. The anger I felt wasn't the sharp kind anymore. It was heavier, like carrying a box you can't quite set down. I didn't excuse what Nathan had done, but I could see the shape of the wound that had made him this way. And yet knowing that didn't change. The truth wounds can explain choices, but they don't erase consequences. This was his to face now, no matter how small he'd once felt in that childhood dollhouse. It was Evelyn who finally filled in the missing pieces. We were sitting at her kitchen table again, the faint crackle of the fireplace behind us, when she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the wood. "Barbara, you need to understand something about Melissa," she said, her voice carrying that calm weight lawyers have when they know a fact will change the whole case. I didn't interrupt. Years before you started helping them, she and a friend opened a home decor boutique downtown. Pretty little place, candles, imported throw pillows, hand-painted ceramics. She poured everything she had into it. Problem was, her business partner was a fraud. Took the capital, took the supplier accounts, and left her holding every bill. Evelyn's expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. She was already drowning in debt before Nathan ever bought that South Hill house. I let the words settle. I'd known Melissa liked the finer things, but I had never imagined her in overalls unpacking boxes in a store, believing she was building something of her own. The image didn't fit neatly with the woman who met me at the door holding a glass of wine, telling me there was no place for me at Christmas. Howard, who had been listening from across the table, added quietly, "That debt never really went away. She just learned to hide it. And the best way to hide a mess is to make everything else look perfect." A flash of Melissa's carefully curated social media feed came to mind: the champagne brunches, the matching holiday pajamas, the charity event photos with her standing in the middle, teeth-white shoulders squared like the camera had been invented for her. None of it hinted at the weight she was carrying. I thought back to little moments over the years. The way she'd glide past a conversation about bills, the way she'd overcompensate when hosting, ensuring the silverware was polished within an inch of its life. Even her constant talk about networking now seemed like another layer of armor, as if making the right friends could keep the wolves from her door. Evelyn poured me more tea. "Barbara, I'm not saying you owe her sympathy. I'm saying you should see the whole board. Her obsession with appearances isn't just vanity. It's survival, at least the way she's framed it in her head." Howard leaned in. "And survival at any cost means shifting the burden to anyone who can carry it, especially someone who won't fight back. That's been you." The words landed like a stone in my chest. I didn't forgive her, not in that moment, maybe not ever. But something in me shifted. I could see now that her choices weren't born only of cruelty or greed. They came from a fear so deep it had calcified into habit, the fear of losing face, of being exposed. And when that fear rules you, you don't weigh the fairness of asking your husband's mother to drain her retirement savings. You just see a lifeline and grab it. Still, understanding wasn't the same as excusing. That evening, after I'd gone home, I sat in my living room with the lights off, the only glow coming from the Christmas tree in the corner. I could almost hear Melissa's voice from that night at the door, clipped, careful, calculated. She had worn her mask so long that I wondered if she even knew where it ended and she began. But the mask was cracking now. My story was out there. The curated image had a fracture running through it, and no amount of candlelight or perfect table settings could hide it from the people who mattered in her world. I realized that in some way the truth was a mirror she couldn't bear to look into, and I had just placed it right in front of her. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because even if Melissa's mask had been built from fear, it had still suffocated everyone around her. And now, for the first time in years, she was going to have to breathe without it. I sat at my desk just after dawn, the house still and blue with the last traces of night. The mug of tea beside me had already cooled untouched as I pulled out a sheet of heavy cream stationery I'd been saving for something important. This felt like it. I didn't want to write in anger. Anger burned fast and left ash. I needed this to hold weight long after it was read, so I began slowly letting each sentence stand on its own. Dear Nathan, I told him about the first year, how he'd called one snowy February evening voice, tight, saying Melissa's job had fallen through and they couldn't make the mortgage. I reminded him of the wire transfer I sent the next morning and how I told him to just focus on getting back on your feet. I admitted that I'd believed those words myself. I recounted the summer after when the roof on my little house had started leaking. The contractor's estimate was less than I'd spent that month on their loan payment, but I told myself the leak could wait. He was my son. His comfort came first. I described without venom the pattern that followed the emergency car repairs that turned out to be Melissa's designer handbags, the unexpected utility bills that lined up neatly with their vacation photos. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften. I just wrote it as it happened. 5 years condensed into paragraphs, not as a ledger of debts, but as a record of choices, mine and his. Then I shifted. I told him about the night of December 20th, standing in the warm glow of his Christmas lights, being told there was no place for me at their table. I explained how the cold I felt that night didn't come from the snow, but from the sound of Melissa's voice, and how I had walked away not to punish, but because I finally understood the role I'd been given in their lives. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't offer forgiveness. Instead, I told him I hoped he might one day see the cost not in dollars, but in the slow erosion of trust, the way love turns brittle when it is treated like an endless resource. When the letter was nearly done, I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old photograph. Nathan was 6 in his red flannel pajamas, sitting cross-legged beside a Christmas tree that leaned slightly to the left. There were only a handful of wrapped boxes beneath it, most from the church's giving tree. His smile was unguarded wide, the kind children give when they believe the world is full of good surprises. I slid the photo into the envelope with the letter. Then after a moment's hesitation, I added a printed copy of Howard's article. It wasn't meant to twist the knife. I simply wanted him to see the truth, laid out in the clean light of print, the same way strangers had seen it. Sealing the envelope, I felt neither triumph nor dread. Just a kind of clarity, like setting down a heavy bag after carrying it far too long. At the post office, the clerk asked if I wanted tracking. I said no. This wasn't a package to monitor. It was a message set adrift to be found when the tide allowed. Back home, I sat in the quiet again, the tea still cold. Somewhere in the city, my son would soon hold my words in his hands. He might tear them up without reading. He might tuck them away in a drawer. Or maybe on some winter night years from now, he'd take out that photo of himself as a boy and remember a time when we didn't need anything more than each other. That possibility, remote but alive, was enough for me to set the pen down. Christmas morning broke soft and pale, the sky brushed with the faint pink of dawn. I left the house early, the streets quiet except for the crunch of snow under my boots. Riverside Park's little cafe sat on the corner like a warm lantern in the frost, its windows fogged from the inside. Evelyn was already there, sitting at a table near the glass, with 2 mugs steaming in front of her. Howard arrived moments after me, brushing snow off his coat, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. The 3 of us settled into the kind of silence that comes easily between friends, no need to fill the air with words, just to prove we belonged. Through the window, children bundled in bright coats, tumbled in the snowbanks, their laughter ringing clear even through the glass. Parents stood nearby with thermoses stamping their feet against the cold. A few teenagers had built a snow fort, declaring it their castle and daring others to try to take it. I let my eyes rest on them for a while. There was something about watching strangers in their joy. It didn't demand anything from me, yet it filled me up in a way I hadn't expected. Evelyn leaned over with a small smile. Better than sitting in some stiff dining room pretending everyone's happy, isn't it? I laughed softly. Much better. Howard, ever the observer, was sipping his coffee like it was the first one he'd ever truly tasted. You know, he said you could make this your new tradition. Coffee and snow instead of carving ham under tense stares. The thought warmed me more than the drink in my hands. It wasn't about replacing one ritual with another. It was about choosing where to put my heart. And here, with these two, my heart was safe. I pulled my phone from my bag and stared at the blank message screen for a moment. I didn't want to reopen wounds, but I also didn't want silence to be the only thing Nathan heard from me. Slowly, I typed, "Mi mong kon, tim lai jok jiokwan trong, me se ojai no kon hora." No accusations, no pleas, just a truth I could live with. I pressed send and set the phone face down on the table. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Expecting an answer, I shook my head. Not today, maybe not ever. But I needed to say it. Howard gave a small nod, the kind that says, "I get it." Then he launched into a story about a family he once interviewed in Montana who'd spent Christmas Eve trapped in a snowstorm with nothing but canned peaches and a deck of cards. By the end of it, we were all laughing so hard that the barista came over just to see what was so funny. Hours passed without us noticing. Outside, the children's snow fort had grown taller, crowned with pine branches. The parents had stopped stamping their feet, caught up in the game as much as their kids. It struck me then, family wasn't about bloodlines or invitations to a holiday table. It was about the people who made space for you without asking you to earn it. The ones who sat with you through the quiet and laughed with you until you forgot why you were sad. As I gathered my things to leave, Evelyn squeezed my hand. "Same time next year." "Absolutely," I said. And I meant it. Stepping out into the cold again, the air felt different, not sharp and punishing, but crisp and clean, the kind that wakes you up to yourself. Somewhere across town, my son might be staring at his phone, deciding what to do with my message. That choice was his. Mine was already made. I walked home through the snow, the sound of laughter from the park still following me, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely free. I can still see that night, as if it were pressed between the pages of my memory, every detail caught in perfect stillness. The porch of Nathan's house glowed with strands of golden Christmas lights, each bulb casting its warm halo over the snow that had just begun to fall. Behind the frosted windows, I could make out shadows, moving people laughing, lifting glasses, music, humming softly under the noise. The kind of scene you'd expect in a holiday card, and yet standing there, I was outside of it all. Melissa's voice still echoed in my head, calm, almost sweet, as she told me there was no place for me at the table that year. The words should have burned, but instead they froze somewhere deep inside. My breath had fogged the air in small clouds, my hands tightening in the sleeves of my sweater as I stepped off that porch and into the drifting snow. I remember thinking that the cold couldn't possibly feel worse than the moment I'd just lived. But as I walked, I found the air sharp and bracing, not cruel. The snow under my boots crunched in rhythm with my heartbeat, each step carrying me farther from the golden light behind me. Those next 6 hours before my phone began ringing, before voices demanded explanations, were mine alone. I drove through quiet streets lit with strings of lights hung from eaves and lampposts. Storefronts sat shuttered yet still decorated with wreaths and garlands, as if the season itself refused to be dimmed. I thought about everything I had done for Nathan and Melissa over the years, how I had blurred the line between generosity and surrender, and how they had grown used to it. There was a strange peace in knowing that the line once erased could be redrawn. That night, Evelyn's kitchen became the place where the frost in my chest began to melt. Her fire crackled. Cinnamon perfumed the air, and in her steady gaze I saw a truth I had long avoided. Helping someone endlessly can keep them from ever standing on their own. When I think of those 6 hours now, they feel like the bridge between two worlds. On one side, the golden closed-off light of a house I wasn't welcome in. On the other, the silver-blue morning light that came later, washing over snowfields and turning the air almost translucent. This morning, sitting in Riverside Park with Evelyn and Howard, I had felt that same light again. Not the kind that blinds you with promises, but the kind that lays itself gently over everything, revealing every shape, every shadow without judgment. It's the light you can breathe in. That's when I understood what I had done wasn't revenge, not really. Yes, the truth had consequences for Nathan and Melissa, but the act itself wasn't about wounding them. It was about reclaiming my boundaries. It was the quiet insistence that I didn't need to be diminished to keep the peace. The lights of that December night still exist in my mind and in the real world. Somewhere they're strung along that same porch, glowing for someone else's evening. But their warmth no longer holds me, no longer defines whether I belong. The light I keep now is different. It's the brightness of a winter morning when your breath comes easy, when the sky is open and clean, and you realize your steps are your own. It's knowing that you can walk away from the table where you're unwelcome and find another where there's a chair waiting just for you. That's the light I choose. And this time, it's mine to keep. It was early spring when the envelope slid through my mail slot landing with a soft slap on the hardwood floor. The return address was one I didn't recognize. Not the familiar suburban street Nathan and Melissa had once claimed as proof of their success, but an apartment building in a quieter part of town. The card inside was simple, a cream fold-over with a photograph of a modest dining table set for two. Inside, Nathan's handwriting, still the same slightly leaning scrawl I'd seen on thank you notes from his grade school years, invited me to dinner. Nothing fancy it read. Just me. I'd like to see you. The date was set for the following week. There was no mention of Melissa. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, the afternoon light pooling across the grain of the wood. Outside, the snow had melted into patches along the lawn, revealing grass that looked flattened but alive. My tea had gone cold before I realized I'd been tracing the loop of Nathan's Y and the word you with my fingertip over and over. In the past, I would have reacted quickly, either in excitement to reconnect or in fear of missing a fragile chance to mend what was broken. But the months since Christmas had taught me something. Not every invitation demands an immediate answer. I thought about the night under the golden lights, the 6 hours that followed, and the winter morning in the park with Evelyn and Howard. I thought about the letter I'd sent Nathan, the truth I'd laid out without spite. I remembered Melissa's face pale in my doorway and the quiet resolve in my own voice when I told them to stay with the family they'd chosen. The truth is, the story didn't end that night, it simply found a new rhythm. Howard's article had faded from the headlines. Evelyn had taken up pottery classes, and I had started spending my mornings walking along the river trail. Life had found its balance again. Now with Nathan's invitation resting in my palm, I felt something I hadn't expected: curiosity, not dread. There was no guarantee that the dinner would bring apologies, or even understanding. But there was a possibility, however small, that it might be a beginning. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I slid the card into the small drawer beside my bed, the one where I keep the photo of Nathan as a boy, beside our old Christmas tree, the same photo I'd sent him with my letter. It wasn't about holding on to the past, but about remembering that people are not just the sum of their worst decisions. The next morning, Evelyn stopped by with a loaf of banana bread, her hair smelling faintly of the kiln from her studio. She spotted the envelope on my counter, but didn't ask. She just poured us both coffee and began talking about her new clay project. That was another lesson I'd learned. Not every important thing needs to be picked apart in conversation. Some are meant to sit quietly until you're ready to open them. Later that week, I found myself standing by my front window at dusk. The street lamps were just beginning to hum to life, casting their amber glow over the sidewalk. I thought about how for years I'd equated Christmas with a seat at a particular table. Nathan's table, Melissa's table, the table where my presence was sometimes tolerated, sometimes unwelcome. But the truth had shifted that belief. Christmas, or any day of love, really wasn't about where you sat or who poured the wine. It was about whether your heart had a place in the room, whether the people around you saw you, valued you without the price tag of obligation. I don't know if I'll accept Nathan's invitation. Maybe I will, maybe not yet. but I smiled as I turned away from the window because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Christmas isn't a place at the dinner table. It's a place in each other's hearts, and I had found my place again.